To those who say, my friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late. To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
That is a young Hubert Humphrey at the 1948 Democratic National Convention, before he became a long-serving U.S. Senator from Minnesota and Vice President of the United States. Back then, he was the mayor of Minneapolis, but his remarks that day in Philadelphia, 75 years ago last week, helped drag the Democratic Party, some of them kicking and screaming, away from the shame of segregation or the equally shameful trait of timidity and kowtowing to the racists. Humphrey spoke for those who knew Democrats had become a permanent minority or even a non-entity in places like Wisconsin, and that it was past time to fight for a platform language that supported civil rights for Black Americans. Author Samuel Freedman has written a new book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights, and he joins us this morning here on Up North News Radio. Sam Freedman, good morning.
It's great to be with you, Pat. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you again for being part of this. Now, I will confess to the listeners, as I did to you, my interest here is beyond the norm, having been raised both in the Twin Cities as well as in Eau Claire. Mm-hmm. And that Senator Humphrey was a larger-than-life elder statesman in my younger years until his passing in 1978. And it surprised me later in life, and kind of does to this day, that history has not given Humphrey his due, and understandably the Vietnam War and the 1968 presidential campaign, were central to that. But now with the passage of time, it's easier to kind of separate the layers. And so if we can set aside the layers of the 1960s and examine the period of the late 40s and 50s, where did Hubert Humphrey leave his mark on history?
Well, Hubert Humphrey was one of the most important civil rights leaders in this country for a long period of time, but especially during the 1940s, which is kind of this overlooked but really essential period of civil rights activity. Humphrey was right there alongside people like A. Philip Randolph, the great Black labor and civil rights leaders, and Walter White, the NAACP, in pushing forward on civil rights in a decade when fighting the war against global fascism had inevitably raised the question of what America was going to do about the forms of intolerance and racial supremacy and religious bigotry here in the homeland. And he was one of the most important voices on that issue. And starting out as mayor in Minneapolis, just a few miles up 94 from where you are in Chippewa Falls, he made Minneapolis a national model of progress on civil rights, coming out of a period when Minneapolis had been deservedly reviled as one of the most discriminatory cities in the whole country against Blacks and also against Jews.
As well as it and St. Paul were just these huge centers of gangland activity as well. And so you had crusaders like Humphrey that, perhaps some other Midwestern cities didn't have and would have been wise to have. But I will ask it this way. Why was it him in 1948? Was it a case of, let this young upstart mayor, let him go out there and commit political suicide? Or was he indeed a motivator and a leader, who, matched the expectations others put in him?
The answer, Pat, is both. He was on a mission, and I've often said that the question was whether it was a political suicide mission, but he firmly believed in it. And just to sort of contextualize for your listeners and your online viewers, as great a president as Franklin Roosevelt was, he'd never been willing to confront the Southern segregationist wing of the party on the Jim Crow system, not in his platform, not in the way New Deal programs were written, not in the way they were administered locally. And Harry Truman was of two minds heading into the 48 election. Partly he was advancing on civil rights, and then the closer we got to the election, the more he wanted to back away and just kick that can down the road the way FDR had. And you also had Southern segregationists saying, we're going to bolt from the party if you do anything on civil rights. And then finally, you had A. Philip Randolph, who I mentioned before, leading a mass movement to have Black young men not register for the draft or not serve unless Harry Truman desegregated the military. And so into this turmoil, here's Humphrey as part of an insurgency within the Democratic Party, pushing a real civil rights plank, something that explicitly says we're going to integrate the military, we're going to have fair employment practices, we're going to put an end to lynching, and so forth. And partly because of his emerging national reputation, and partly because of his great oratorical skills, he's given the task of selling this platform plank to the whole convention. That happens July 14th, 1948. And it's not just that he's talking to 1,500 delegates and alternates, and it's not just that he's talking to 15,000 people in the convention hall. Believe it or not, there are 70 million people watching on TV or listening on radio to that speech in real time. It's like the Super Bowl in terms of audience.
That's a great point as well, because again, political conventions were, well, they weren't the produced stage shows that they
Right.
are today. Actual business happened there. And in that age of radio and early TV, I mean, people really hung on what was in a party platform. It told you quite literally what it stood for, compared to, say, the 2020 Republican Party, which said, we're not going to have a platform. It's whatever Donald Trump wants,
Right.
which just tells you how far we've come. Let's get to the Wisconsin tie for a moment here, and start in Wisconsin. Now, we know one of Wisconsin's U.S. senators back then was Joseph McCarthy, and history has given him all the scorn he deserves, and we can get to him. But I also want to make note that Wisconsin's other senator at the time, Alexander Wiley, was from right here in Chippewa Falls. And so I wanted to know, between Wiley, McCarthy, other Wisconsin figures, to what degree did they figure either into Humphrey's moves or other either support or opposition to embracing civil rights?
Well, there's a great Wisconsin angle here that I'm very happy to share. Humphrey couldn't just stand up and give the speech because he wanted to give the speech. There was a whole complicated process of how you put a platform plank up to all the delegates. And it wasn't easy to do, especially when the incumbent president wanted to have this quashed in committee. And one of Humphrey's most important allies was a labor leader and former member of Congress from Milwaukee, and former member before that of state legislature, named Andrew B. Miller, who everyone called Andy. And Andy B. Miller was an expert in parliamentary procedure. And not only was he allied with Humphrey on civil rights, but he understood all these abstruse and intricate rules on how, even if you had lost on your platform plank in the platform committee, which Humphrey had, you could get a second chance speaking to the whole convention. And it actually shocked Truman's people who were running the convention that Andy B. Miller knew how to maneuver it so that Humphrey could get to give the speech. And he and Humphrey had been planning this out for weeks ahead. Heading into the convention, Humphrey goes down to the Milwaukee area, where Andy B. Miller has a house a little bit outside Milwaukee, sort of in the Pewaukee area, if not in Pewaukee itself. And they map out, here's how we're going to make sure that we are able to give the speech, even if we lose at an earlier stage. So B. Miller is one of the unsung heroes of this. And of course, the Wisconsin delegation at the convention votes in favor of this plank. As you said, this was a really key issue in many parts of the country, not just states that had a large number of Black voters, where you had a lot of big city political bosses saying, we've got to endorse civil rights because we've got to improve turnout, or not only are we going to lose the presidency, but we're going to lose all the down ballot races. But you had states like Wisconsin with this, progressive and liberal tradition, also, unfortunately, that counter tradition of people like Joe McCarthy, but at least in the Democratic Party, a tradition that wanted to keep moving forward with a liberal agenda. And civil rights in 48 was the key part of that agenda.
And it was because, again, for folks who might be too young to really appreciate this, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't happen in a vacuum. This was decades in the making of filibuster after filibuster after filibuster, primarily from Democrats and Southern Democrats at the time. And it took people like Hubert Humphrey and others to flip the script. And so you hear people today saying, well, our party, the Republican Party, our party is the party of Lincoln, and your party is the one of segregation. Well, yeah, once upon a time, but
Mhm.
you're kind of ignoring history, especially 1948, if you're still sticking to that trope.
Exactly. What happens in 1948 is when the civil rights plank wins and Harry Truman ends up needing to run as a civil rights candidate. And 2 weeks after the convention, he issues executive orders desegregating the military and desegregating the federal workforce. That's the realignment we're living with now. That moment sets Democrats enduringly on the path to being a multiracial, interfaith party of inclusive democracy. When the Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats, leave, that's the beginning of the process that will lead them to becoming Republicans, starting with Barry Goldwater in 64, Nixon in 68, Reagan in 80, and now Donald Trump, in 16 and 20 and probably 24 as well. So it is when the script gets flipped, and it's so intellectually dishonest to say that the Democrats still are the party of segregation. When they ousted their extremists in 1948, they did what the Republicans have been totally unwilling to do with Trump and with the Trump movement, which is kick out the crazies, kick out the bigots.
Right, and it's not a given that the GOP would simply accept having the script flipped and allow itself to become the modern day bastion of opposition to civil rights, voting rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even an honest teaching of American history. So, what led the party of Lincoln to become the party of Lee Atwater and Karl Rove and now Donald Trump?
Well, the first thing that happens is you have the Goldwater insurgency in 64. That's the kind of the beginning of the rise of the new right, even though by today's standards, Goldwater would probably be in the Lincoln Project. But Goldwater comes out against civil rights laws. He doesn't seem to be personally bigoted, but he makes this argument of quote unquote states' rights. And that's a dog whistle to Southern segregationists to vote for him, especially when he's running against LBJ in 64, who's already pushed through, with Hubert Humphrey's help, the Civil Rights Act of 64. Although Goldwater loses massively, it's a sign that Republicans can get votes from the segregationists of the South. And Richard Nixon, then in 68, who'd previously been pretty progressive on civil rights. In fact, Martin Luther King almost endorsed Nixon for president in 1960. Richard Nixon runs on the so-called Southern strategy, which means, again, to appeal to this opposition to civil rights in the South, and moves forward on that progress. Ronald Reagan, again, someone who I don't think at a personal level was a bigot, but is willing to play that card, starts the 1980 campaign with a rally in Philadelphia, Mississippi, near the place where the three civil rights martyrs, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were murdered by white vigilantes. So this is all a process that moves along. And even though there's some Republican candidates who push against it and try to bring it back towards the party of Lincoln, like John McCain, and with all of his other flaws, George W. Bush, I think, was the best Republican president on race since Lincoln. But they lose control of the party, and now we are where we are. And that's a point where you can't even teach honestly about
Mhm.
slavery anymore.
Isn't that something? So, my last question, I've got a minute for this, is what are the chances this can flip again, say 75 years from now? Can we say that some young Republican halted their party's march toward extremism and irrelevance the way the Democrats faced it back then? Or is the money too much? Is the media infrastructure too rigid for the Republican Party to change its ways?
I think they have to lose a lot more elections and lose them badly, and then hopefully someone will emerge. Either that or the party will formally crack into two things, and one part of it will take up the voice of what the Republican Party used to be on issues of racial equality.
Samuel Freedman is an award winning professor, columnist, author of 9 acclaimed books, a staff reporter from the New York Times from 81 to 87, and so much more. And the book, again, is called Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. Sam, thank you so much. It was great to be able to talk to you. And let's do it again a little later as you're making this book tour.
I totally enjoyed it, Pat. I'll be very glad to be back. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, back with Todd Alba after this. You're Up North.
And equality wisely well. My good friends, I ask my party, I ask the Democratic Party to march down the high road of progressive democracy. I ask this convention to say in unmistakable terms that we proudly hail and we courageously support our president and leader, Harry Truman, in his great fight for civil rights in America.